there, everybody. I am Reverend Cooper, and I'm bringing you the second installment of our Proverbs Bible study. Last week we covered chapters 1 through 3, and this week we'll be looking at chapters 1 through 4 in depth. Beginning with chapter 4 and continuing with the breakdown of each chapter into different little segments, and then looking at each verse or sort of zeroing in on important verses. First, I will say that verses 1 through 9 resume the father's speech to his son, where in these scriptures, he's telling his son how to get wisdom. And what he's trying to get or to hold on to is actually a woman, and that would be woman wisdom, who he would attain for himself. And then in verses 10 through 27, you have the father really laying out for the son the two paths before him, one of light and one of darkness. Certainly the woman of wisdom would be associated with the path of light, while the woman of folly would be associated with the path of darkness. Moving into some specific verses, verse 6 talks about woman wisdom and how the son can love her, and then how she will guard him. And verses 8 and 9 talk about her exalting him, the son, and how she will then bestow on him a beautiful crown, all of which is to suggest that woman wisdom in these verses is an actual Israelite woman to be sought after by a young man, or all Israelite men for that matter, and it is positing woman wisdom very specifically as one type of character, and that would be a good wife. And so, from all of these specific verses, loving her, she'll exalt you, she'll crown you. These are all actions that an actual woman would take, and so when we look at woman wisdom as a wife, we're distinguishing her from the other types of characters that she can be throughout this narratival portion of the book of Proverbs, where she's presented as a teacher or as the personification of wisdom. Here she is distinctly the wife. Then in that second portion of chapter 4, we see these two paths emerging, and they're described in more detail by the father. And most of that's pretty self-evident, so I don't need to spend much time explaining that. But something that is interesting is that they're previously laid out as two paths, one of wisdom and one of folly, and we get them coupled with in chapters 1 through 3 with righteousness and sinfulness. But here we get a triple sort of addition, and that would be the associations of light and darkness. So it's no longer just wisdom, righteousness, all on one path. It's wisdom, righteousness, and light versus folly, sinfulness, and darkness. I want to shift a little bit and talk about feminism in chapter 4. It's definitely present in chapter 4 in ways that it's sort of implicitly present in chapters 1 through 3, comes out more explicitly here, where the exaltation of the wise woman begins to revere an Israelite woman or a wife in honorific ways. Although she will exalt the husband, these ascriptions of what a young husband's life might be like when he finds a good woman suggest that a good wife is to be lauded and praised. And so in that sense, there's reverence for a good wife that's really coming out explicitly in chapter 4. And so I'm imagining what Israelite daughters might be hearing when they were being taught these wisdom sayings. And, it's definitely possible that they would be hearing the description of a good wife as something for her to eventually become. But what's more interesting than her limited role as being a wife would be that in some sense what the authors are suggesting is that Israelite young women are able to develop their character independently of their role as a wife, which is to say that there is value found outside of her status as a married woman. It rests in her virtuosity. So, despite the fact that women were kept back in patriarchal societies like ancient Israel, a woman was able to build up her character independent of that status. And so that is definitely an empowering message for daughters born into a patriarchal society. There's an element of choice present for any young woman presented with these paths of virtuosity or unvirtuous choices. And so that element of choice is a rarity in ancient times. This can definitely be an upbuilding text for women in this regard. But then I want to start to talk about the limits of feminism in Proverbs and to sort of weigh that against what can be seen as a feminist perspective put forth by the biblical authors of this book. Okay, first and foremost, there's an element of female oppression present simply in the fact that the audience is male and not female. Fathers are talking to sons. Male scribes were writing this to male readers, not females. And this isn't to say that women were excluded from learning. Women were also educated in the home and possibly in schools and things of that nature, as is debated about the setting for the book, whether or not it's in the home or in the school. Young women were still educated, but it does voice quite clearly that men's education held a primary position over against the education of women. So teaching sons was more important than teaching daughters. There isn't a corollary to the book of Proverbs that says that there's a personification of male wisdom that women are supposed to learn, for example. And then secondarily, I want to push back on this idea that female value was actually independent of marriage. That yes, women could help to define their own value in terms of their own virtuosity, but how far did that extend? And there's a clear limit in the fact that they were owned by men, either their fathers or their husbands, and this societal structure was built almost entirely upon the honor and shame system, which put yet another set of limitations on young women. So let's talk some more about the honor and shame system. You may not have heard of this as readily as you've heard of the purity system in Hebrew culture. We are familiar with the purity system because it's so much of the content of the Hebrew Bible. You hear about it in the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Exodus. It's about priestly codes and levirate marriage and all of those kinds of religious laws. And so the purity system is linked to religious legalism, and it's really drawn straight out of the Bible as a result of that. But in Israelite society and in culture, therefore influencing the biblical text, there were definitely household codes that were related to the honor-shame system and helped to build the honor and shame system. So those household codes had a lot to do with sexual morality. Why? Because family lineage was patrilineal, and so the honor of a household was upheld by the sexual mores of the home. And so the shame of a household would happen because of sexually immoral conduct. And this was almost totally dependent on female honor. It had very little to do with male honor. It was, like I said, just dependent upon how women comported themselves and maintained their honor so as to uphold the honor of the household name, and any sort of defiling of the female would then have cast shame upon the household. That would have lowered societal status for the entire household. And so there's a lot riding on young women and wives. Defiled women and androcentrism. So just some more on the implications of that sort of honor shame framework and how that was dependent on women. So women were carrying the honor of the household in a sense, although men got to herald that honor in the social scene. If a woman was married off as a virgin, then she would uphold the honor of the household. But incredible dishonor and shame would be brought on the home and the household name by marrying off a promised virgin who turned out to be a non-virgin. And, that was sort of one example within which the honor system was upheld, but there were a variety of other ways in which that was done, and a lot of that has to do with protecting marriage. That's where the book of Proverbs really comes into the discussion about honor and shame. Anyway, men sought to control women's bodies to maintain their societal status as honorific. That was just a fact in this patriarchal society. And part of what I find interesting in that structure is that male honor is not defined at all by virtue of character. It is dependent on honorable female sexuality. In a sense, then, it is defined by male control of female bodies. And so women's choices are quite limited as a result. They're either honorable and virtuous, or they're shameful and sinful. There's only two choices for women. And should you happen to lose your honor at any point, then there's no way to reclaim that. You're cast out of the honor system, and you've now just been categorized as shameful. Men, however, definitely had more ability to exercise choice. They had the ability to make, and therefore the ability to make, immoral decisions that did not bring shame on the household. So in some sense, they kind of get off the hook with sexuality and shame, whereas women get really burdened and shrouded with sexual shame. So part of what we aren't hearing in this book, and part of what makes this anti-feminist, is the fact that we don't hear young women being told, find a good, virtuous husband. We're only hearing to young men, find a good, virtuous woman. Where's the equality in this kind of message? It's definitely patriarchal. Another implication here is that there is the potential for grace to be applied to men. This two-path system of virtuosity, wisdom, lightness versus darkness, unrighteousness, and folly is sort of a false dichotomy, if you will, because inherent in these teachings is the fact that men are empowered with choice. They have a right to, they're entitled to choose one path over the other. And with every step, there remains yet another choice. So they're empowered to make these decisions. And in those choices, it could be argued that at any step along the way, as they're traveling down a certain path, they have the ability to choose another path. So say you're going on the right path, you end up going on the wrong path for a little bit, you can still possibly get back on the right path because there's always another step for you. Last week, I asked you all about grace, and did that seem to be built into the system of wisdom and folly? And this is where I think you could make that assertion, that there is some form of grace applied to young men who have chosen the wrong path at some point, that they still have the opportunity to get on the right path, and they would not be condemned to the path of folly, the path of sinfulness, the path of darkness forever. Unfortunately, that doesn't extend to women given the societal framework of honor and shame. Within that context of honor and shame, women are not afforded, awarded, or given the grace that men would be given with these options before them of veering off the path and being able to get back on the right path, because once defiled, always defiled. There's no redemption of honor once it's lost. You are cast off into the shame category, and there's no redemption for women who have lost their honor. Moving on to chapter 5. Again, bracketing out the chapter into verses 1 through 14 and then verses 15 through 23. Verses 1 through 14 is the father forecasting what happens if you choose the path of the loose woman, and also being very clear about what will happen if you choose to stay on that path. So it's a warning, but it's also very clearly the father telling him what to expect should you go down the path of sinfulness. And then verses 15 through 23 are the father encouraging the son to settle down with the wife of his youth. And that would be in contrast to the previous verses. Instead of going down the path with the adulteress, the path of unrighteousness, you should marry, and marry the good woman. The whole chapter focuses on wisdom and folly as women with respect to marriage. Clearly there's the adultery, and then there's the marriage portion. So the woman in this chapter is playing the role either as the adulteress in the first set of verses, and then as the wife in the second set of verses. She would be the adulteress in verses 1 through 14, and the wife in verses 15 through 23. And just sort of putting this into context with the numerous characters that these women become in the book, woman wisdom is strictly defined here as the wife. Her other roles as teacher or just the personification of wisdom are not applicable here. We're talking about a good wife. The role of marriage being central here gives a clear message again about the household honor system. Fidelity is a primary value. It is paramount to the honor-shame system, but it's also a beautifully healthy value that we're getting from the book of Proverbs. It's saying, if and when you are married, be faithful. It will uphold the covenant vows that you took, and it will maintain a path of righteousness for you. You will avoid the path of folly, the path of unrighteousness, and all that comes with it should you remain faithful to one another. Now, when the author talks about the wife of your youth, which first comes out in chapter 2, verse 17, that can be taken to mean the son, who is the audience here, the son's wife, the one that he would marry, since marriage took place in such earlier ages back in ancient Israel. So it would have literally been the wife of your youth. There's not some supposed other wife that comes in your older age, for example. And it is noteworthy to point out that sexuality is encouraged within the framework of marriage. That comes out in verses 15 through 23. The ethics of sexuality aren't questioned when it's done within the covenant of marriage. And in fact, it's celebrated here in this text, which is important. That's something that you see in wisdom literature, particularly in the Song of Solomon. Whereas much of the Hebrew Bible, and certainly in the New Testament, it is not celebrated. It is often considered to be shameful. And so this works within the honor-shame context and says there's no shame associated when done in the right context. And so that is one ethic that we're clearly getting from chapter 5 and other chapters throughout the book of Proverbs, mirrored in the Song of Solomon, other wisdom literature. But back to this description of the wife of your youth. This description gets scholars' attention. It comes out first in chapter 2, and we see it again here in chapter 5. And the debate is, what kind of wife? Is this a literal wife, or is this a metaphorical wife? Because the language of covenant is so strong. So the other wife, as opposed to the literal one that she would in fact marry and would have been an Israelite woman, is an allusion to religious adultery. So the wife of your youth would actually be the God of Israel. This would have been taught to young Hebrew men. And the God that they were taught to be in covenant with, not to actually marry, but to give their faithfulness to in a covenantal form, would be the God of Israel. And there would be no other God stressed repetitively throughout the Hebrew Bible. And that wife, they would have been introduced to at a very young age, and it would be presumed that as they aged, they would have met other gods, if you will. And there would be the threat of going into covenant with another God, of cheating on the God of Israel. And this was a huge threat for the Hebrews. There were so many foreign powers that came to reign in the ancient Near East. So it was a chronic issue, persistent throughout all of Israelite history. And you see that voice coming up in all of the books of the Hebrew Bible. So in some sense, this is just part of practical wisdom to the ancient Israelites, saying, hey, we're teaching you to love the Lord your God and the only Lord your God. And that love ought to be sealed as if it were a covenant of marriage. And don't cheat on your God, by the way, because that's going to bring a lot of hell your way that you don't really want to take on. So that's sort of another way of reading that wife. Moving into chapter 6. Bracketing chapter 6 off into two distinct passages. We have verses 1 through 19, where the father is sharing with the son strictly practical wisdom. It's a departure from the description of the two females and the author's literary use of those two characters as didactic tools. It's just the father shooting it straight, saying, here are things to do. And in that teaching, he's warning against laziness. He's sharing the 7 things that the Lord hates and really trying to keep it straightforward in terms of teaching ways to be wise, ways to build up your righteousness, And this is sort of what we would associate with the book of Proverbs, not so much the women as we've been studying in this Bible study, but typically when we think of the book of Proverbs, we think of that main corpus in chapters 10 through 30, where we get wisdom sayings of King Solomon. And this is sort of mirroring that style of writing. So as to, in some sense, scholars would argue that this was edited in intentionally to bring some cohesion to the overall book. When these bookends, 1 through 9 and 31, were tacked on to the main corpus of 10 through 30. Then in verses 20 through 35, we pick back up the use of the women. And here specifically, we're talking about the adulteress. And the father is sharing more anti-adultery teachings, and he ramps it up in this chapter. He really lays the groundwork in chapters 1 through 5, and then here it becomes more severe, the language around adultery and committing adultery and what would come with that. And so whether or not you interpret that adultery to be religious adultery or an extramarital affair, the weight still holds. There is incredible focus put on faithfulness in covenant. And that covenant is played out in this context as a marriage covenant. And you can adapt that to a covenant to God or a covenant to your partner in life, Israelite man to woman. But regardless, there is incredible anger aroused either on behalf of God or on behalf of the Israelite society around any form of infidelity. We'll get into what forms of infidelity are really considered problematic in our next slide. But when I was saying that it ramps up in this chapter in terms of the problems that come with adultery committed, that comes out in numerous verses in this chapter, at least 5 of them, where it is biblically warranted to punish adultery. And we see that elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, but here it is reiterated. And so adultery isn't just bad, it is worthy of punishment. So we're going to talk some more about sexual morality, because of course that is part of the central message here when we're zeroing in on verses 20 through 35 and talking about adultery. Household codes were built on marital fidelity and female honor. That female honor was held up by a female preserving her body for her husband and her husband only. And then in verse 26, we have just kicked it up a notch. We have gone from the loose woman, the adulteress, the foreigner, this sort of temptress character, to very specifically the Hebrew term is used for prostitute. And so in the English rendering of the Hebrew text, we see the term prostitute. There was in fact a distinct term in Hebrew, in ancient biblical Hebrew, distinguishing between the loose woman and an adulteress and actually a prostitute. So the authors here did mean someone who was solicited for purchasing sex. And so it's an alarming word, but what it does is it draws out more about Israelite culture around fidelity. And interestingly enough, it highlights the fact that prostitution was not seen as shameful. In fact, the verse reads that a prostitute's fee is only a loaf of bread, but the wife of another stalks a man's very life. And the contrast here is suggesting that it costs nothing to lay with a prostitute, whereas laying with another man's wife costs you your life. Obviously, the stakes are a lot higher if you were to cheat with a married woman. But an alternative implication there is that it doesn't really matter if you sleep with a prostitute. And so in my studies of this text, that led me to some really, really in-depth research around this issue. And there's a lot to be said about it. What I will say is that there were temple prostitutes in ancient Israel. There were all kinds of feelings around how prostitution was not a big deal because it did not disrupt the family lines. It didn't disrupt the honor shame system. Because these women were already deemed to be shameful and they weren't going to be married, there was no honor on the line. But these were also women that weren't necessarily kept. So they would be women who would be foreigners. They might be widows. They could fall into the category of having been a temple prostitute, or they could have already been defiled in that shameful category already. So you sort of get this this category of women that don't count, if you will. And so it doesn't matter anyway what happens with them. And that wouldn't do anything to a man's honor should he lay with her. But that aside, what this is also saying is that fidelity was not defined by male faithfulness alone. It was female faithfulness that defined an extramarital affair. A married man could sleep with a prostitute and not have been considered to be a cheat. That's one way of reading the text. You could also read it as though a single man were to lay with a prostitute and didn't cause any dishonor to come upon his household. So in that sense, it doesn't then become about the covenant of marriage being threatened only by a female, but you can read it that way. So, benefits from this kind of reading. There's an obvious double standard going on here, and it's not doing very much for empowering women, but something that cannot be overlooked and must be read into all of this sort of feminist interpretation of the book of Proverbs, particularly when you are taking a postmodern context and reading it back into biblical times, is to understand that there was some form of protection that was ensured for women, particularly women that were kept. You know, we were talking about how prostitutes were in an unkept category. They were, in the shameful category. Those women, not protected. Wives, however, very well protected. And, yes, they were owned and they were, in some respect, objectified by the honor shame system in that they became objects of honor. They brought honor to the household, and that was to some degree the limit of their function if you're to look at it very surface level. But on the other hand, if you messed with somebody's wife or their daughter, chapter 6 is saying how clearly a father or a husband is then able to take revenge on behalf of their daughter or their wife's honor. And so it's sort of, in that sense, it's then exalting the female again by saying that she's worthy of protection, she's vulnerable and needs protection. So that's one way to read it. But I will say that there are some questionable motives there if you're looking at protection as the primary motivation for preserving a household name. Should it be defiled by another man? Would it be that a father or husband was seeking revenge, or that they were just protecting their beloved daughter or wife? Both are possible, but I would argue, and I think a lot of scholars would fall in line with me here in saying that revenge would have been taken more for the loss of status that would have come from losing an honorific household name than that would have happened if a husband was seeking to protect his wife. So in some sense, there's got to be a motive for, there's an economic motive here, there's a status motive here, there are other things going on here that have actually nothing to do with the woman. All of this is to say that it's extremely complicated, and you can't just read these passages and say, oh, okay, now women have been lauded as wonderful by this Hebraic text, the book of Proverbs. There's so much more going on here historically within ancient Israelite culture. The honor-shame system, the religious laws, what the authors were doing, what they weren't doing, the literary devices that they were intentionally employing to make implications versus explicitly sharing certain things. There's so much more to it. And we've been digging deeper into these women, these female characters. Last week in chapters 1 through 3, we got a snapshot of these women. We got an introduction. And this week, we're getting a fuller view of who these women are. They're developing. There's new roles that are coming forward. It's no longer just the loose woman and woman wisdom. Now we have the wife and the adulteress. There's now a prostitute in there as well. So, their complexity has begun to really develop, and that will only further develop as we move through our study. I can't wait to get to chapter 31 with you, where some redemption for these ladies takes place, and I think really a crowning achievement for women in Hebrew culture and society that's carried on for us today becomes the legacy of the book of Proverbs over against these two females who unfortunately sort of create a difficult dichotomy for young women to have to struggle with, contend with, and enter into. And eventually when we get to chapter 31, we'll see it all sort of neatly tied up in a way that offers hope for women and hope for us as readers of this who are poking holes in some of the feminist ways of reading the book. So, closing thoughts. Primarily, I want to encourage you to think about the women in these chapters. And I would ask you how your thoughts about women's value as put forth by the authors here changed since we first started. When we looked at chapters 1 through 3, I'm wondering, did you think something differently than what you're thinking now about what this book says about female value? So I put that question to you, ask you to ponder it as you reflect on 4 through 6 and 1 through 3, and then prepare for our following week's readings, which will be 7 through 9. And I will look forward to continuing studying the book of Proverbs with you then.